Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. We now move on to the Kitab Salat al-Istisqa, the prayer for the rain. To seek rain is something which is sunnah during times of drought, when there is no rain, or during times when there may be rain but crops are not growing. Because what's the point in having water when the crops do not grow? Some scholars have said that the Salaah for the rain is not legislated, but rather you just make a dua. This is the Hanafi opinion. The other ulama say that the Salaah is legislated. We have evidence authentically that the Prophet ﷺ prayed 2 rak'at for the Salat al-Istisqa. The method of praying this prayer is the same as the Eid, with the extra takbirat and so on. There is also a khutbah as well, and the majority of the scholars say that this khutbah is given after the Salah. However, we do have a narration in Sunan Abi Dawud authentically that the Prophet gave the khutbah for the Salat al-Istisqa before the Salah, and then he prayed the 2 rak'at. So the first hadith in this book is the narration of Ubad ibn Tamim al-Mazini, who heard his paternal uncle, who was one of the companions of the Prophet, say that the Prophet went out one day to seek rain, and he turned his back to the people and made dua to Allah facing the Qibla, and he turned his rida inside out, so outside goes to in and inside goes to out. And then he prayed 2 rak'at. Also another wording says that he went out to the musalla to make the istisqa, and this would have been the musalla of the Eid. And so you go out there in the open because this is an action which shows that you are more needy of Allah Jalla wa Ala, and it shows you to be much more humble, rather than doing it in the comfort of your local masjid. And also, out in the open you can acquire a larger gathering, which is always better. Why did he turn his rida inside out? As a sign that hopefully the weather will turn inside out. So it is dry, it will turn to rainy. So it was like a sign of good hope. And so from this, the ulama say that it is recommended then for the Imam to do the same thing. Al-Imam Abu Hanifa opposes this view though. He says it is not recommended. But the narration is clear-cut, and there's no problem for us to take from it. We can also take the clear rule that the Salat al-Istisqa is 2 rak'at. And in some of the narrations, it is mentioned that the Prophet prayed the Salat al-Istisqa just like you pray the Salat al-Eid. And other scholars say that you don't have these extra takbirat. As for where it says that he prayed the Salat al-Istisqa just like the Salat al-Eid, then this is talking about the number of rak'at, and in terms of it being a loud prayer and the same surah being recited, and also it being before the khutbah. However, if the narration is to be followed, then when we say he prayed the Salat al-Istisqa just like the Salat al-Eid, then it would have to include the takbirat as well, and this would be the stronger opinion. The next narration about raising your hands in your dua whilst seeking rain. From Anas, he says, I saw the Prophet ﷺ raising his hands in the dua until the whiteness of his armpits could be seen. Also from Anas ibn Malik, he says that the Prophet was pointing with the back of his hands towards the sky. So normally when you make dua, the palm of your hand is facing the sky. But here he's saying that the back of the hands of the Prophet were facing the sky. Now, this does not mean that the Prophet had turned his hands around and making dua like that. No, rather it means that he was making dua and raising his hands just as normal, but he had raised his hands so far up such that the back of his hands were facing the sky. So if you raise your hands just like you make dua as normal, but now raise them very high up, if you do that, then you will notice that the back of your hands will start to face the sky instead of the palm of your hand. So that's how much the Prophet exaggerated in raising his hands when making this dua for the rain. And the previous narration says that the whiteness of his armpits could be seen, so it shows us that he raised his hands so far up. Now this istisqa, or seeking the water, is not in the form of a salah, it is simply in a form of a dua. And we know this happened when the Prophet was giving the khutbah and a man came to complain that there is no water and the animals are dying out. So here the Prophet did not pray 2 rak'at, rather he's just simply made dua and raised his hands far up. Also in the chapter, Anas ibn Malik says that the Prophet would not raise his hands in making dua for anything except the istisqa until the whiteness of his armpits could be seen. Now somebody might take from this that the only time the Prophet would raise his hands in dua is when he was seeking rain. And this is not the case. We have many other examples in which the Prophet did raise his hands when making dua for other than rain. For example, a time when some of the mushrikeen put the camel's intestines on his back when he was making the sajda. When the Prophet finished the prayer, he raised his hands to make dua against those particular mushrikeen, and we know that those mushrikeen fell at the Battle of Badr. But the point is, he raised his hands in making dua, and that was not istisqa. Rather, the way to understand this narration would be that the Prophet did not raise his hands in such a way that the whiteness of his armpits could be seen, except when making dua for rain. Another possible interpretation of this statement could be that Anas himself did not see the Prophet raise his hands in this way. But that does not mean that other companions did not see the Prophet raise his hands in making dua for other than rain. So these are two possible interpretations, if we want to reconcile the evidences. The next narration about the dua in the istisqa, from Anas ibn Malik, he says that a man entered the masjid on Yawm al-Jum'ah from the direction of the Darul Qada, and the Prophet was giving the khutbah at that time. He faced the Prophet standing up and he said, "O Messenger of Allah, the wealth has been destroyed and the roots have been cut off. So make dua to Allah to grant us rain." And Anas says the Prophet raised his hands and he said, "Allahumma aghithna, Allahumma aghithna, Allahumma aghithna." "O Allah, send us down some rain to take us out of despair." And he said that 3 times. And Anas said, then he says afterwards, a cloud came up just like a shield, and when it came into the middle of the sky, it broke up and started to pour down rain. And he says, "Wallahi, we did not see the sun for a stretch of time." And Anas says that the next Friday the same man came whilst the Prophet was standing giving the khutbah, and he said, "O Messenger of Allah, the wealth has been destroyed and the pathways or the roads have been cut off. So make dua to Allah to hold back the rain from us." And the Prophet raised his hands and he said, "Allahumma hawalayna wa la alayna, Allahumma ala al-akami wal-dhirabi, wa butun al-awdiyati wa manabit al-shajar." And Anas says that the cloud ceased to exist and we walked out in the sun. And Sharik, one of the narrators, says that I asked Anas, "Was the second man the same as the first man who came to ask?" And Anas said, "I do not know." So we find Anas says that a man came into the masjid from a door from the direction of the Darul Qada. This is a house which, when Umar radiallahu anhu died, it was sold so that the debt which was upon Umar could be paid off. This debt has been narrated to be 86,000. So this man comes in and he says that the wealth has been destroyed. This is because no water means the animals are going to die off, and the routes or the pathways have been cut off. If there are no animals to ride, then you cannot traverse the pathways because the distance will be far too long for you to travel on foot. So he asks the Prophet to make dua. Why can't he make dua himself? Well, because you can use somebody who is more pious than you to make dua, because his dua is more likely to be answered. And they would always use the Prophet to make dua for these serious affairs. And the Prophet makes dua for ghayth. Now ghayth is the rain which comes after you have been in despair, as opposed to the rain which comes when you're not in despair. And this dua was answered immediately, and the rain came flooding down. So much so that the next Jum'ah another man came, and Anas here does not know whether this man was the same as the first man. And in a narration of Al-Bukhari it says that this second man was the same as the first man. So anyway, he says that again the wealth is dying and the routes or roads have been cut off. Here the animals are dying because of the water now. So notice this, at first they were dying due to lack of water, and now they're dying because they're drowning. And likewise the routes have been cut off because there are no animals to traverse them, and it could also mean that it's been flooded. But here the Prophet did not make dua to stop the rain. The rain is a blessing, it would be unwise to ask for rain to be stopped. Rather he asked Allah Jalla wa Ala to direct the rain where it is needed most, and where it will not cause inconvenience. So he said, "O Allah, around us but not on us." He said, "Allahumma ala al-akam." These are the hills, but not as big as mountains, so high places like hills. وَالضِّرَابِ, and on high places. وَبُطُونِ الْأَوْدِيَةِ, and in the depths of the valleys. وَمَنَابِتِ الشَّجَرِ, and the places where the trees grow. So we can take from this narration that the istisqa does not have to be by way of salah, it could be just a dua. And also we find that when you're in desperation, you should repeat the dua, just as the Prophet did here. He made the dua and repeated it twice when he asked for the ghayth, which is the rain. We can take from this narration that it is permissible for a member of the congregation to speak to the imam when he's giving the khutbah, and the other way around is permissible as well, if it is for a genuine need. Also in the chapter, from Anas ibn Malik, when the rain would come down, the Prophet would remove some of his clothing so that the rain could touch his body, and to justify it he would say, لِأَنَّهُ حَدِيثُ أَحْدٍ بِرَبِّهِ تَعَالَى, it has newly come from its Rabb. So we may say that this is a sunnah as well, to attain some of this rain, rather than put the umbrella up. But it is difficult to make an analogy with all types of blessings which have come from Allah Jalla wa Ala. For example, crops that grow in your farmland, or for example, if a child is born to you, and all these other types of ni'mah, do you touch them to your body? No, that is not the sunnah. It appears this particular sunnah about touching it to your body is pertaining to the rain specifically, because the Prophet did not do this with other types of newly arisen blessings from Allah. The next hadith is about seeking refuge when you see wind or clouds coming your way, and to be joyous with the rain. From Aisha, she says that when the wind started to blow strongly, the Prophet would say, Allahumma inni as'aluka khayraha. O Allah, I ask you for the goodness of it, wa khayra ma fiha, and the goodness that is in it, wa khayra ma ursilat bih, and the goodness with which it is sent, wa a'udhu bika min sharriha, and I seek refuge in you from its evil, wa sharri ma fiha, and the evil which is in it, wa sharri ma ursilat bih, and the evil with which it has been sent. And she says when the cloud would come with thunder and lightning, the color of the Prophet would change and he would start walking in and out of the house. He would start walking back and forth. But when it would start to rain, he would be relieved of his anxiety. And she says that I would notice this on his face. And she asked him about this. And the Prophet said, perhaps it could be, O Aisha, as Allah said, فَلَمَّا رَأَوْا عَارِضًا مُسْتَقْبِلَ أَوْدِيَتِهِمْ قَالُوا هَذَا عَارِضٌ مُمْطِرُنَا. And when they saw the rain cloud approaching their valley, they said that this is the cloud which will give us rain. So this ayah is talking about the wind which destroyed Ad. They thought that it was a rain cloud coming their way, but rather it was an extremely powerful wind which completely destroyed them. And so the Prophet is saying that maybe we are going to be afflicted with the same type of wind. So from this we take the softness of the heart of the Prophet and how much fear it had, such that even if there was a dramatic change in the weather, the Prophet ﷺ would seek refuge in Allah, that it may well be the punishment of Allah descending. And also from Ibn Abbas, the Prophet said, نُصِرْتُ بِالصَّبَةِ وَأُهْلِكَتْ عَادٌ بِالدَّبُورِ. We have been granted victory or help with the Sabah, and this is the wind from the east, and Ad were destroyed with the Dabur, that is the wind from the west. Allah Jalla wa Ala helped the Prophet and the companions during the Battle of Ahzab. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اذكروا نعمة الله عليكم إذ جاءتكم جنود فأرسلنا عليهم ريحا وجنودا لم تروها وكان الله بما تعملون بصيرا. It says that Allah Jalla wa Ala sent wind against the Ahzab to help the Muslimin in their battle. So we learn from these narrations then that the Muslim should have a soft heart, one which is filled with the fear of Allah, and that when the wind blows strongly, then this is a legislated dua to be made, because the wind is necessary to drive the clouds. But then again, this very same wind can cause much death and destruction, as we can witness. We can witness the goodness of the wind, and we can witness the destruction caused from the wind. And so this is why it is legislated to make this type of dua, to seek the goodness of the wind and to seek refuge from its harms and destruction. Let us now move to the Kitab al-Kusuf, the book of the eclipse, and we talk about the Salat al-Kusuf, the prayer of the eclipse. It can be pronounced Kusuf or Khusuf, it means the same thing. Both the sun and the moon can be eclipsed, which is when their light disappears as they are covered. This is a prayer legislated to be prayed. Most scholars say it is sunnah and not wajib, But if we take a look at the evidences and ponder over it, it becomes known to us that this has to be a wajib prayer, whether it be prayed in the masjid or in the home, as it is not befitting that Allah Jalla wa Ala sends us a manifest sign in covering the sun or covering the moon, and we just sit there enjoying the show or doing nothing. This is not befitting of a Muslim. The Prophet prayed it, and he ordered verbally that it should be prayed, so this should be good enough to say it is wajib. But also, like we said, when you ponder over the situation, it is not befitting that a Muslim does not pray the Salat al-Kusuf, rather we say it needs to be wajib. In this first narration of Aisha, she explains how to pray the Salat al-Kusuf. She says that the sun was covered or eclipsed during the time of the Prophet, and the Prophet stood up to pray the Salaah, and he stood up in the prayer for a long time. Then he made the ruku' and went into a long ruku'. Then he raised his head and he stood up in this second standing in the first rak'ah, but this standing was less than the first standing. Then he went into the ruku' again, and this ruku' was long but shorter than the first ruku'. Then he went into the sajda, so he raised back up again and went to the sajda position. Then after that he stood back up, and this would be the second rak'ah, and he stood up for a long time but shorter than the first standing in the first rak'ah. Then he went into ruku' in a long ruku', but it was shorter than the first one. Then he raised his head and he stood in a long position but shorter than the first one. Then he went into the ruku' again, and this ruku' was shorter than the first one, meaning the one before it. Then he continued on to go into the sajda position, and then afterwards he completed the prayer as normal, and the sun at that time had come into view, and he gave a khutbah to the people. He praised Allah, extolled Him, and he said, إِنَّ الشَّمْسَ وَالْقَمَرَ مِنْ آيَاتِ اللَّهِ وَإِنَّهُمَا لَا يَنْخَسِفَانِ لِمَوْتِ أَحَدٍ وَلَا لِحَيَاتِهِ. The sun and the moon are from the signs of Allah. They are not eclipsed due to the death of anyone, nor due to anyone being born. فَإِذَا رَأَيْتُمُوهُمَا فَكَبِّرُوا وَادْعُوا اللَّهَ وَصَلُّوا وَتَصَدَّقُوا. So if you see any of these two, meaning any of these two being eclipsed, then make takbir, make dua to Allah, and make the salah, and give sadaqah. Then he said, Ya ummata Muhammad, إِن مِّن أَحَدٍ أَغْيَرَ مِنَ اللَّهِ أَن يَزْنِيَ عَبْدُهُ أَوْ تَزْنِيَ أَمَتُهُ. There is no one more jealous than Allah that his male or female servant should commit fornication. So just like, for example, you would not want your wife to commit adultery because you have this protective jealousy, or your daughter to be committing zina because you have protective jealousy. Well, no one has more protective jealousy than Allah Jalla wa Ala. So in this there is a severe warning against all fornicators. And then he said, Ya ummata Muhammad, O ummah of Muhammad, لو تعلمون ما أعلم لبكيتم كثيرا ولضحكتم قليلا ألا هل بلغت. If you knew what I knew, you would laugh little and cry much. Behold, have I conveyed the message. So first of all, the description of the Salat al-Kusuf, what's happening here is that he's praying 4 rak'at in 2 rak'at. So he would pray the first rak'ah as normal, and it would be a long standing, then going into ruku', and he comes back up from the ruku'. Normally he would go back into sajda, but here he would simply treat this standing position as a second rak'ah. And then he would go into the ruku' and come back up again, and then go into the sajda. And the sajda would be just as normal, the 2 sujood. Then he comes back up for the second rak'ah. In fact, this is effectively the third rak'ah really. Then he makes this standing position, and it is shorter than the first rak'ah. And then he goes into ruku', he comes back up, and then he stands up for a 4th rak'ah. And he does the normal recitation. Then he goes into the ruku' again and completes the salah as normal. So effectively he has prayed 4 rak'at in 2 rak'at. And he has made a ruku' 4 times instead of 2 times. And as for the sajda, then this hasn't changed, 4 sajdat in 2 rak'at as normal. Now there's a difference of opinion when he comes up for the second rak'ah in that first rak'ah after the ruku'. Should he recite al-Fatiha? Most scholars say yes, he recites al-Fatiha. He treats it just as a normal rak'ah. Some scholars say no, he doesn't. But it is better to recite the Fatiha because it is effectively like a second rak'ah in the first one. And then he will recite the surah. These 2 extra rak'at are sunnah, they're not wajib. So if you pray the Salat al-Kusuf just as a normal 2 rak'ah prayer, it would suffice and would be valid. The reason for adding in these 2 extra rak'at in the 2 rak'at is to prolong the prayer, because the idea is that the prayer should span the whole of the eclipse. And then it is legislated for the Imam to give the khutbah afterwards. The Prophet said in his khutbah that the sun and the moon are from the ayat of Allah. They are not eclipsed due to the death nor birth of anyone, because the people of Jahiliyyah would believe that the sun and the moon would be eclipsed because a great personality has died or a great personality has been born. But the Prophet here is refuting this batil idea. But rather this is simply a sign from Allah Jalla wa Ala. So he says, if you see these 2, meaning either the moon or the sun being eclipsed, then you need to make takbir, make dua to Allah, perform the salah and give sadaqah. It is not befitting for a Muslim to treat this time period just as any other time period, or worse yet, enjoy the show just like the kuffar do. Bring the family out and have a picnic. And he said, O Ummah of Muhammad, if you knew what I knew, you would cry much and laugh little. So if you knew how severe the revenge of Allah Jalla wa Ala is against the people who transgress His limits, and if you knew about the severity of His punishment, and about the frights of Yawm al-Qiyamah, and about the Barzakh, and the reckoning, and so on, then you would laugh little and cry much. The Kuffar's lifestyle, of course, is all about having a joke, having a laugh, making fun of the believers, and just generally having a good old entertainment. That's their life. Their life is no different to just one massive dalliance. And so Allah Jalla wa Ala says about them, فَلْيَضْحَكُوا قَلِيلًا وَلْيَبْكُوا كَثِيرًا جَزَاءً بِمَا كَانُوا يَكْسِبُونَ. So let them laugh a little, but cry much, as a recompense for what they used to earn. This prayer is prayed aloud, as it is mentioned in one of the narrations of the chapter from Aisha, that the Prophet raised the voice in the Salaah. So it was a loud prayer. So just like any other big congregational prayers, Salat al-Kusuf is another big congregational prayer, or at least meant to be, and so it is a loud prayer, just like the Salat al-Istisqa, Salat al-Eid, Salat al-Jum'ah, and in this one as well, Salat al-Kusuf, the big congregational prayers are loud prayers. Okay, what would happen if you finish the prayer, but the eclipse has not finished? Well, in a case like this, the ulama say that you continue to make dua, to make istighfar, to make dhikr of Allah Jalla wa Ala, until the eclipse finishes. This is the idea, that you are constantly remembering Allah during the eclipse. Remember what the Prophet said in the hadith, that when you see both of these signs, you make dua, you make the salah and give the sadaqah. And he says in another narration, فَإِذَا رَأَيْتُمْ كُسُوفًا, when you see them both being eclipsed, فَذْكُرُوا اللَّهَ حَتَّى يَنْجَلِيَ, then remember Allah until it clears away. So the idea is until they clear away, meaning until the eclipse clears away. The next narration talks about the punishment of the grave from Amra. She says that a Jewish woman came to Aisha and she said to Aisha, may Allah protect you from the punishment of the grave. And so Aisha said to the Prophet, will the people be punished in their graves? Now at that time the Prophet ﷺ did not have the answer, because nothing was sent down to him. So it happened that there was an eclipse and the Prophet prayed the eclipse prayer, and when the prayer finished, he raised his head and he said, إِنِّي قَدْ رَأَيْتُكُمْ تُفْتَنُونَ فِي الْقُبُورِ كَفِتْنَةِ الدَّجَّالِ. I have seen you being tested in your graves just like the test or the tribulation of ad-Dajjal. So it proves that we will have a fitna or a test in the grave. In the next hadith, the Prophet ﷺ during his prayer of the eclipse was shown many signs. From Jabir, he says that the sun was eclipsed during the time of the Prophet, on the day when the Prophet's son Ibrahim died. And so the people said, oh look, the sun has been eclipsed because of the death of Ibrahim. And as we said before, this was a popular belief amongst the Jahiliyyah, that the sun is eclipsed due to the death of a great personality or due to the birth of one. And so he says that the Prophet stood up and he prayed 6 rak'at and 4 sajdas. So 2 rak'at, but 3 rak'at in every 1 rak'ah. So 2 times 3 making 6. And he goes on to explaining the Salat al-Kusuf, and the explanation is the same as what we have given. But then afterwards the Prophet explained some of the signs which he saw during this salah. He said that there is nothing you've been warned except that I saw it during the Salah. He said, I saw the fire. And this is why during the Salah I moved back for fear that it might touch me. So during the Salah al-Kusuf, the Prophet moved back because he saw the fire. And he says, I saw the person who owned a hooked walking stick dragging his back in the fire. He used to use his stick to steal from the people making Hajj. If somebody would notice this man plucking his belongings away from him, the man would say, oh, pardon me, my stick just got stuck to your wallet. But if nobody noticed, he would quickly make away with other people's belongings. And he says, I saw the woman who owned a cat. She would just tie the cat back and not feed it. And she would not let the cat go out to eat from the animals of the earth until the cat died. And he says that Jannah was brought to me, and that was at the point when you saw me move forward in the prayer. And I stretched out my hand to take from some of its fruits, so that I could show them to you, but then I thought better of it. So there is nothing which you have been promised except that I saw it in this Salah of mine. And also in another narration of the chapter, we find that the Prophet ﷺ said, you will be tested in your graves, similar to the severity of the test of Ad-Dajjal. And he explained this fitna by saying that you will be asked, what do you know about this man? And as for the mu'min or the muqin, he would say, Huwa Muhammad, this is Muhammad. Huwa Rasulullah, he is the messenger of Allah. Ja'ana bil bayyinati wal huda, he brought us the evidences and the guidance. فَأَجَبْنَا وَأَطَعْنَا ثَلَاثَ مِرَارٍ. So we answered him and we obeyed. 3 times he will say this. So for this type of person, the mu'min or the muqin, it will be said to him, Nam, sleep. We knew that you had iman in him, so sleep as a righteous person. But as for the munafiq or the murtab, then he will say, La adri, I do not know. I only heard the people say such and such, and I just repeated that. So I just followed the people, whatever they were saying. In another narration of the chapter, he says that he saw some fruits of the Jannah, and he says that if you were to eat them, you would continue eating them as long as this world exists. And he also said that I saw most of the people of the fire to be women. And the reason he gave is because of their kufr. He was asked, do they make kufr in Allah? He said, no. بِكُفْرِ الْعَشِيرِ وَبِكُفْرِ الْإِحْسَانِ لو أحسنت إلى إحداهن الدهر ثم رأت منك شيئا قالت ما رأيت منك خير قط. He said, no, it's not kufr in Allah, rather it is kufr or ingratitude towards the husband and towards the good which he does to her. He says, if you were to treat your wife well the whole time, and just on one instance she sees something bad about you, or you mistreat her just once, she would say, you have never treated me well. And in this there is an incredible lesson for the women, which is to say that they need to be aware that their husband is not going to be Mr. Perfect. He's going to treat her well much of the time, but he may well mistreat her some other times. He's not perfect, he is a human, and hence the idea needs to be to keep things in balance. So if he does mistreat you, then think of the times that he treated you well, just to keep things in balance, and not to be ungrateful for the good treatment which he has given you. The exact same ruling applies to the man. The Prophet ﷺ said, لا يفرق مؤمن مؤمنة إن كره منها خلقا رضي منها خلقا آخر. A believing man should not hate his believing wife. If he dislikes one part of a character, he would be pleased with another part of the character. So the same thing goes with the man. If you see your wife mistreating you or playing up, and it makes you angry, then at that particular point in time, you need to remember the good parts of her character, because this will balance out the scale. So the same ruling applies to both the man and the wife. When you see in your spouse something which you dislike, or some part of the character you dislike, or perhaps they are mistreating you, then it is exactly at that particular point in time where it is upon you to remember the good parts of their character, or those times when they treated you well, because what you need to do is to balance out the scale, and this will go a long way to pacifying your anger. And in another narration we find that this eclipse is there to frighten the people. that Allah Jalla wa Ala is watching them. So from the hadith of Abu Musa in the same chapter, the Prophet ﷺ during the eclipse became afraid. He thought that this might be Yawm al-Qiyamah. And so he went to the masjid and he prayed long rak'at. Abu Musa said, I have never seen him pray as-salah this long before. And afterwards the Prophet said, إن هذه الآيات التي يرسل الله لا تكون لموت أحد ولا لحياته. These signs which Allah sends, they are not due to any death or birth. ولكن الله يرسلها يخوف بها عباده. But rather Allah sends these to strike fear into His servants. فإذا رأيتم منها شيئا فافزعوا إلى ذكره ودعائه واستغفاره. So when you see any of this, then be afraid and hurry to His dhikr, His dua, and istighfar, seeking forgiveness. Now, with regards to the Salat al-Kusuf, there is an important issue to note here. We mentioned that the Salat al-Kusuf is 4 rak'at in 2 rak'at. But there are other narrations in Sahih Muslim which talk about 8 rak'at in 2 rak'at, so 4 each, and another narration which talks about 6 rak'at, so this would be 6 rak'at in 2, so 3 in each. Now this cannot be possible because the eclipse only happened once during the life of the Prophet, so he only prayed this prayer once. So we cannot say on one occasion he prayed 8 in 2, and on another occasion 6 in 2, and on another occasion 4 in 2. This is impossible. He only prayed it once. So which one is it then? Well, we say that the wording which speaks about 8 in 2, and the other one which speaks about 6 in 2, these are shadh, or an anomaly. So this is something which, even if it's authentic, it opposes something which is more authentic. So in Al-Bukhari, you do not find these wordings of the 8 and the 6. So we take the wording which speaks about 4 in 2. And that's how the Salat al-Kusuf is to be prayed. There is another discussion amongst the ulama. Is this Salat al-Kusuf prayed only for the Kusuf, for the eclipse, or could it be for any major ayah? For example, a tsunami, or some sort of massive tornado, or a hurricane, or the like. Some scholars say no, it is restricted for the Kusuf. Others say it can be for major signs. And it has been reported that Ali radiallahu anh prayed a Salat al-Ayah, the Salah for the signs, as 6 raka'at in 2, so 3 each. And so Ibn Taymiyyah says that yes, this can be done if there is a major sign, like a one-off sign, a big tsunami, or a hurricane, or some sort of tornado. These are massive signs which Allah sends to frighten the servants. Remember about the Kusuf, what did the Prophet say? وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ يُرْسِلُهَا يُخَوِّفُ بِهَا عِبَادَهُ. But Allah sends these to frighten His servants. But the eclipse is not the only sign which could frighten the servants, rather. There could be other signs like earthquakes and tornadoes and tsunamis and so on. These are all frightening signs from Allah. So therefore, by way of analogy, we could say that you can make this salah with these other great one-off signs. Okay, let's take some review questions. Question number 1. How is the rain prayer prayed? Question number 2. How is the Kusuf prayer prayed? Question number 3. Can we pray the Kusuf prayer for all scary type of signs like tsunamis and earthquakes? Justify your answer.